Hi there, my name is Philip Ideson. I want to welcome you to the Art of Procurement podcast, the podcast that helps you, a forward-thinking procurement professional, position yourself and your team to proactively take advantage of the revolution that's taking place in procurement today. By interviewing industry trailblazers and sharing insights from our own experiences, my team and I pull back the curtain and shine a light on the strategies, tactics, and tools that procurement teams are using to elevate their impact. And today on the show, I'm joined by my good friend Mark Holyoake. Mark is the Managing Director of Holyoake Search, a recruitment specialist focused on the procurement industry. Mark has been a regular guest on the podcast and one of our earliest subscribers and advocates, going all the way back to 2015. So it's my pleasure to welcome Mark back onto the show this week. We discussed the general health of the procurement job market and how that's evolved over the past couple of years for both hiring managers and candidates, along with tips for any listeners who may have recently been impacted by workforce reductions at their companies or are afraid that they may soon be impacted. And so I started by asking Mark if he could share, for those who haven't listened to our past podcasts, if he could share a little bit of his background in supporting the procurement industry.
So, this is my 21st year in the recruitment business. And I think 19 of those years have been focused purely on the procurement function. So, back in 2004, I was recruiting in accounting and finance, talking to CFOs, I guess, about what was keeping them up at night. And it wasn't the need for another accounting and finance recruiter, but it became increasingly obvious in speaking with them that there was an emerging trend, that being procurement, that was becoming increasingly important to them strategically, but it hadn't been met with a corresponding increase in the number of professional search firms that really understood and played in this area. They didn't know where to turn to find really good people. It was starting to become known more commonly how to instill strategic procurement and sourcing and category management principles, but the how to do that and the ability to find good people to actually execute on those plans, that was becoming a real source of competitive advantage, and these companies were largely struggling with that. And so that's how it sort of started. It's mushroomed from there. And today, for those that don't know, I run a specialist recruitment company called Holyoake Search, and we focus on permanent placement, or largely permanent placement and executive appointments, within the procurement function, solely within that function for companies across most every industry within the United States.
Mm-hmm. Now, I'm not sure if you remember, and I may have said this on the last pod, but we first worked together. I think it was back in end of 2005, beginning of 2006. You were working on a search for a financial services company in New York, and I was going through that process, and I obviously didn't do my work well enough because I didn't end up getting that role. But that was the first time that we worked together. So a long time ago, and very beginning of Art of Procurement, you were such an early advocate. I think something like subscriber number 5 or subscriber number 6. All those years ago. So it's a pleasure to welcome you back onto the show.
Well, thanks. I'm not a procurement practitioner per se, and I haven't been, and I get asked that question quite a lot, but I don't think that takes anything away from my genuine, sincere interest in the profession, right? It's what I followed for 95% of my professional life, and I've absolutely loved to see where it's come from, where it is now, where it's going. For a long time, I think procurement has been looking to be recognized and looking for that spotlight to be focused on it, and really, that momentum has been growing, but it's really in the past few years, I think, that we've really seen a meaningful sort of shift in the way procurement is perceived, at a lot of companies, and it's super exciting. So I was interested in what you were doing back then, and I'm really interested in what you're doing now, and indeed what a lot of your guests, are doing and thinking. Yeah, I love it. So thanks to you for what you're doing to the community as well.
So we last talked, I was looking back in the archives, and I think it was, even though it seems like it was 2 minutes ago from some regard, I think it was back in maybe September or October of 2020. So everyone's kind of still trying to figure out the lay of the land from the pandemic, businesses starting to dip their toe in the water of reopening, and trying to figure out what that means for our profession. Here we are, what, 2.5 years later. What kind of roller coaster has it been in the procurement recruitment market over that last 2.5 years?
I think that's a good term for it. Honestly, roller coaster. It's been interesting, right? On the one hand, at the start of the pandemic, we naturally saw an increased need for practical procurement advice that needed to be dispensed to a lot of companies that were worried about their supply chains, worried about their cost base, worried about the risk that existed amongst their vendors, and at the same time, a lot of those companies just simply weren't in a position to invest. A lot of them were waiting and seeing, and we weren't quite sure, when the dam would break, so to speak. But it did, and the last 12 to 18 months has seen, I guess, a level of recruitment activity within procurement, the likes of which I had not experienced in 20 years of doing this. A bunch of reasons for that. Again, one, demand. This was a necessary investment at a lot of companies for all the reasons that procurement practitioners have been sort of screaming about for many years. But also because there was a period of no hiring, we saw a lot of sort of pent up demand, right? So by the time companies started hiring, there was 12 months worth of openings that needed to be filled as soon as possible, and it's been great, in a sense, for the profession, right? There's a spotlight on it. It's taken on this increased importance a lot of companies. It's driven salaries in a largely positive direction, and some may talk about sort of salary inflation, getting out of hand, and we can get into that a bit later. But a lot would say that that those salary increases should have happened over a period of years before that. They were simply normalizing, and I largely agree with that as well, right? We had seen up until that point companies offering the same kind of money as they were 3 to 5 years before. It's not a tenable situation, and those companies were really exposed in the last 12 to 18 months because they realized they had a lot of competition. They were tripping over other companies to try to acquire the same talent, and the weaknesses in their hiring and screening and onboarding processes were very quickly exposed. So it's been a roller coaster. Again, largely it's been wonderful for the profession, and now we've kind of come to the end of that, and things are not as they were over the last 12 to 18 months. And I still think that 2023 will be sort of net positive. But it was never a sustainable situation to begin with. So I think we're starting to see the end of that, and we're entering a new phase of recruitment. And so it'll be interesting to see how that sort of plays out.
And so to not necessarily a downward shift, but not more of a normalization of the market. Is that fair to say?
Yes. Again, you can read the mass media, right? They make money off bad news, and so it's very easy to look at the headlines, and it's not to sort of minimize the magnitude of layoffs that we're seeing, particularly across the tech sector, but I don't also think that that's sort of an accurate proxy for what we're seeing across the overall market and not within procurement. It's interesting, that's cold comfort to people within procurement that have recently been laid off. Obviously, that's very personal, and those people are going to be working hard to secure something new, and we can talk about that in a bit. But overall, I think the rate of hiring that we had seen over the last 12 to 18 months was always going to hit a wall. It wasn't sustainable. Simply put, at the beginning of that 18 months, it was great. There's a lot of jobs available and there's a lot of available talent. But as we go through, that period of hiring, it becomes clear, after not very long, that access to talent is becoming increasingly difficult, and then to a point where it's becoming almost impossible. And those people that were willing and open to making a move have already made a move, and those that are holding out are beginning to ask for close to the impossible. And there was always going to come a point where we were going to see that slow down back to a bit of a normal rate. And right now, I think everybody sort of hit the reset button. There's going to be a period of a few months where a lot of companies are just sort of waiting and seeing, largely. But then again, I expect activity to pick up again. In some respects, I think this is if not a mirror image, then a sort of a toned down version of what we saw, a few months into the pandemic, right? There is undoubtedly still a need for procurement people that hasn't gone away. And every report or article that you read about procurement trends in 2023 puts talent shortage, right, at the very top of their list. They know that it's a difficult environment, but they also know that they need talented people in order to realize their ambitions for their procurement functions. So it's undoubtedly still a need that exists. And the truth is that a lot of procurement people are still gainfully employed. Those people, a lot of them that moved over the last 12 to 18 months, they're still happy where they are. So there's still not a huge available talent pool. And so what we need, again, is to see that easing a little bit. And again, I think that'll take a couple of months. And then I think, honestly, we'll see the market returning to some sort of sense of normality. And that's not unlike, again, what I saw, let's say 2 years ago, not unlike what I saw in 2008. I think it was 2000, maybe a few years later as well. Each of the downturns, we've seen procurement remain an important part of the business. And yes, there are some companies that are going to show a knee-jerk reaction and lay people off, which I think is crazy within procurement. But I'm biased, but in the main, I think we're going to see a period of a reset, a short slowdown, and then I think we're going to see some sense of returning back to normal, honestly.
And I think that's encouraging for anybody who may be listening who has had the unfortunate experience of their company laying off folks and that may have been personally impacted, that it's not necessarily systemic across all industries or companies. It's kind of targeted and specific to industries, as you see most of the layoffs at the moment. So there are other opportunities out there.
Yeah, it feels very personal, right? When it happens to you, and when you again consider your situation against the backdrop of what you're reading in the press, it's very easy to think that there's sort of no hope for procurement recruitment in the next 6 to 12 months, and I just don't think that's the case, right? Tech is obviously reducing its workforce significantly, but I read a report recently. Those numbers still pale in comparison to the number of people that those exact same companies hired over the last three years, right? So again, it doesn't sting any less, but I don't know that is is necessarily representative of an upcoming sort of downturn, a massive downturn that's going to that we're going to see across all different industries, right? We look at tech, okay, but we look at life sciences; they're growing like crazy. We look at maybe fintech, even some financial services. Again, we're seeing a lot of demand in those industries, and for every, let's say, Fortune 50, Fortune 100 company that's announcing, wide-scale layoffs, there is a $1 to $3 to $5 billion firm that is just super excited about their upcoming investment in procurement and being able to, go out there and attract individuals in the market that they might not normally have access to. And so, part of what I think job seekers need to do is consider companies, outside of the traditional areas in which they have operated, and acknowledge that there is absolutely still a significant demand for their skills, and it's not going to be the same kind of market as it has been over the last 12 months. They need to acknowledge that, but overall, it's a positive market. There is demand for their skill. They're just going to have to be a little bit more flexible in terms of, what they're prepared to look at, the kind of companies, the kind of industries, and consider again, opportunities that sit outside of where they might normally have considered.
Yeah, my working kind of hypothesis as an outsider, looking at the job cuts that we see and that we see reported is absolutely, there was maybe an over exuberance of hiring in 2021 and 2022 that just overshot the mark a little bit. And it's not that all those new positions are going away, but there's maybe this realization that maybe we just hired a little bit too aggressively. And so it's resetting a little bit. And that's what's going on, as opposed to it being, the start of a multi-year recession or, a barren job market or anything like that. It feels like it's just correcting because, people are valuing different things. Maybe investors aren't valuing so much growth at all costs, and they want to start seeing profitability. And so it's just making kind of tweaks, which again, there's no consolation to those impacted, but that's kind of my macro 35,000 foot view of everything that we hear that's going on in the hiring market. And the thing for procurement, and this is because you mentioned it before, we know the role that procurement can play in more difficult times. And in some way, as a profession, we're generally insulated from the worst of the impact, but you can't escape company politics, and at the end of the day, if there are job cuts to be made, procurement can't necessarily say, hey, but I want to hire people while cuts are being made elsewhere from a headcount perspective. So even though we're known that we're kind of part of the solution, not the problem, some businesses it's still going to impact procurement, and we're going to be asked to do more with less while that initial phase of resetting happens. And then once that's happened, it's like from a PR perspective, a company has gone through that letting folks go, and then they can quietly start building the areas of the business they need to build first. And procurement is one of those that then gets invested in.
1000%. And it's that period right now that I think we're right in the middle of. It's going to take a couple months for companies to say, okay, we're putting a freeze on everything while we evaluate, where we are and where we need to be and where we are going to think about making some selective hires. And I think we're going to get to that point, relatively soon. But again, for every company like that, there are others that are just chomping at the bit to hire folks. And I think hiring managers know that in the main, layoffs are not sort of performance.
Yeah.
based, right? Sure, the sort of the Jack Welch model of cutting your bottom 10% every few years. I know that exists, right? But by and large, I think these layoff decisions, if not arbitrary, they are certainly not based purely off of assessing your workforce and then cutting the lowest performing. So some of the people that are out there looking are exceptionally strong individuals that have just been unlucky, and it's beyond their control. And that means there is this wonderful group of talented people out there actively looking, and it's stressful, but at the same time, I think they should be excited about what new doors may open for them, because again, the demand is still there. There is still no shortage of companies looking for procurement talent, despite what, again, a lot of people may think. And they're finally, able to actually access some people. They've been used to, over the last sort of 3 to 6 months, even, a situation where their pipeline is utterly empty because there are 50 companies looking for the exact same person. And even if you get to talk to that person and bring them through your interview process, unless you have unlimited pockets or these phenomenal benefits that can distinguish you from a sea of other companies, you probably aren't going to get those people you want anyway. And so again, it was getting to that point where it just wasn't sustainable, where people were asking for some crazy stuff, and companies were starting to resent that, I think, honestly, or it was starting to get to a point where it was going to put a target on those individuals' backs, which I don't think is a good thing either. And so, again, whilst individuals who have gotten caught up in this, it isn't going to change their situation, right? Overall, I think that this was always coming, and in some respects sort of necessary. And I think the rebound for a lot of those people will be far, far faster than they perhaps are worried that it may be.
You talked about demand, supply and demand, and certainly last year that it was getting to a place where there just wasn't the candidates to fill the open roles. And maybe that's starting to thaw just a little bit at the moment, but is there a certain profile? Are you seeing that it's because there's a certain profile in demand, and it's that profile of candidate that is hard to recruit, or is this across all profiles within procurement?
Yeah, good question. Let me perhaps say something first. So the question of talent shortage, right, is one that I think we need to define a little bit more carefully, because there were many companies out there, really screaming that there aren't any, individuals in the market at all to hire. There's absolutely no one. And the truth is that uncovers some rather bad habits on the part of the companies who, in truth, were still looking for someone to do a job for them, who were doing the exact same job for another company, and just literally move them over laterally and pay them a little bit more money for the pleasure of working for them instead. And companies have long sort of thought that way, unfortunately, while simultaneously ignoring entire swathes of the procurement candidate pool out there, right? Including those individuals with a lot more experience, who have long been marginalized, right, in favor of up and coming talent, right? And individuals who had a lot of the constituent skills to do the job, but had never done that exact job before. And so if there was one thing that, the last 12 months, has forced companies to do in a really positive way, is to start getting a little bit more creative in terms of how they assess potential talent and what they screen for. It's forced them to sort of stick their neck out and be a little bit more brave. And I always fear that once the tables start to turn again, and there are more, there's more readily available talent in the marketplace, and those companies are just going to go back to some of their bad habits. So with that said, there are some companies that are going to do a much better job of hiring over the next 12 months than others. I would like to see, again, more companies being more creative with their hiring, but there are undoubtedly still some skills that are sort of classically more in demand than others, right? If you are a software category manager right now with 5 to 7 years of experience, and you're talking to, and you proactively reach out to 10 or 20 companies that are of interest to you, the likelihood is that I'd say 50 to 75% of them will call you back, whether they have an active requisition available or not. And so there are always going to be some categories, that companies don't believe can be effectively managed by anyone other than someone with an in-depth knowledge of those supplier markets and those vendors and pricing models and so on. So it's a little bit of a mixed bag. Again, there is definitely room, and there always will be room for those individuals with very specialist skills who want to continue on in a very specialist role. And I think those positions will always, they'll continue to be very well paid. But I would like to think there is an emerging and growing market for generalists who are looking for interesting challenges with interesting teams and the opportunity to do something a little bit different than that which they have been doing for the past few years. And again, I hope that there's an increasingly large, proportion of companies out there that are willing to entertain those people as well.
Do you see a market for transformation-related roles, or are those still really just going to consulting firms to come in and do a project and then kind of move on their way? I'm interested, it's because we talk about transformation all the time, and transformation really to me now is continuous improvement. Are those things that teams are hiring in-house for, or are they still looking outside for that kind of talent?
There are those roles, right? Whether they are a procurement strategy manager or director, or someone sitting within a procurement COE aside of the category sourcing teams. But in truth, that represents a pretty small number of folks out of the whole department, and everybody wants those jobs. So they are super competitive. And yes, invariably, they end up going to people whom either are currently sitting in that kind of a role elsewhere, or someone who is looking to make a transition out of management consulting, who is looking to take a leap into corporate, but isn't looking for a more one-dimensional sort of category manager role, or what they perceive to be a more one-dimensional category manager role, but they're looking for something a little bit more project-based. So yes, those roles exist, and yes, everybody seems pretty open to them, but I would probably advise against people hanging their hat on landing a role like that at the expense of looking at anything else, because they are far more competitive.
So, and it's really interesting to kind of understand, because you see some of those roles in the market, but like you say, those are the ones that everybody kind of wants. And interestingly, because there's a lot of supply for those roles, that probably impacts the salary inflation, because it's all supply demand based. I was interested because you mentioned salary inflation before. Do you see that that's a rising tide lifting all boats? And by all boats, I mean all professions, all job roles, titles across procurement, or whether you're seeing that inflation specifically focused on certain, really highly in demand areas of experience or expertise, like you referenced before. You've got the 5 to 7 years of cloud sourcing experience, and it's just very specific roles that are seeing more inflation than others.
No, I think we're seeing salaries going up across the board, which is great. I will just say, just to go back to our earlier point about those sort of procurement strategy roles, it is interesting. I think they are interesting roles, but nowhere in my experience, has what I have seen led me to believe that those roles offer a kind of a faster route up to senior leadership roles within procurement or the CPO's office. They really, they don't. So they are interesting enough, but for people coming out of consulting, or indeed anyone else that's looking for an interesting transformational role, I would look, very, very readily at more traditional sourcing positions as well. I think they can be equally interesting, equally transformational, and arguably can put you in a position to deliver on some pretty big projects that are going to get you a lot more attention internally, and in a way that's going to help your career trajectory. I genuinely believe that. I think those strategy roles, they're always interesting, but I don't know. I don't know that they need to be sort of put on the sort of pedestal that historically they have been either.
No, I just want to jump in because that's really interesting because, I did maybe a role or two like that in my career as a practitioner. And you do, when you're doing it, you think, now I've got greater exposure, more insight to the CPO, all those things that you think from a career perspective. But also the thing about those is probably the type of person that goes into a role like that, and this was certainly the case for me, kind of is bored with the status quo. And so you go in and you're doing kind of helping a change journey. And then after 12 months or 18 months, you're kind of looking and thinking, okay, what's next? And so they're not necessarily roles where the persona that is attracted to those roles doesn't necessarily want to stay around for a long time anyway. So perhaps it is better to be working on the consultancy side where you're getting exposure to a variety of different clients. And so there's always different experiences than doing something like that within a single company, unless that company is, a Fortune 10 or Fortune 20 company, where there's always going to be some interesting things that you can drive.
Well, yeah, absolutely. Well, historically, I think a lot of people that went into procurement assumed that it was a one-way journey, but they would never come back out. That was what they had committed to doing for the rest of their career. And if they committed to going into an IT sourcing role, well, then that was also what they were going to be doing for the next 10 or 20 years. And it was, I think, seen that this procurement strategy type role was in fact the opportunity that they needed to keep a lot more options open, and I just don't see that as being the case anymore. I think procurement has done a better job in recent years of raising its profile, of doing the PR necessary to attract really high caliber, high performing, high potential people in who they knew were going to end up sort of moving around within procurement and then potentially transitioning out into another part of the business. And they've let them do that. And in doing so, again, I think they've been able to attract some fantastic people into all manner of roles, whether it was a category manager role or a strategy role or a procurement tools and technology role. So companies are, I think, heading in the right direction here. I think we just need to remind individuals looking to make a move that they can find opportunities to really move the needle and make an impact in a variety of different roles. And that could even be, procurement operations. If I look at the typical procurement officer profile, the one consistent thing is that there is no consistency. It just so happened to be someone that was very good at building relationships internally, and whatever project they were given, they just did an incredible job with it. But there was never this sense that you had to go through these sort of predefined steps on your journey towards becoming a head of procurement. Yeah, not at all. Absolutely not. Yeah.
And so I interrupted you, and I think you were just going to talk about whether you're seeing specific salary inflation across different job roles, as well as it being a general, positive for the entire profession.
It's a fantastic positive, right, up until a certain point, of course, because human nature is people are going to start gaming the system if they can. But yeah, overall, I think we have seen a lot of inflationary pressure on salaries, and a lot of that, as I said before, has been really more sort of normalizing. It's been taking a lot of stagnation across the profession in terms of salaries and bringing a lot of existing people up to market. And there's a few reasons for that, right? One, procurement is having its day, right? It's in the spotlight. It's a contemporary issue for a lot of companies, never more so than now. And they realize, they should be paying these people more than they have been. Two, the fact that, legislation in many states, and indeed most companies have taken sort of a blanket approach to this across the US, that states that these companies cannot ask a candidate's current salary as part of the interview process, has stopped companies fixating on what people earn and giving them just a little bit more, and sort of keeping them stuck in this never-ending, vicious cycle of being underpaid, right? So it's allowed
you pegged to the first salary that you got.
It has allowed individuals going through an interview process to peg, what they earn far closer to what their skills, in the current market, demand that they earn, and that's a wonderful thing overall, right? So I realize that wasn't, the legislation was, rightly sort of targeted originally towards, those individuals that frankly were getting paid less than their counterparts, women, people of color, right? Unfortunately, those statistics, do persist, but they're improving. But overall, I think it has helped the procurement profession more generally kind of get to where it needs to be from a salary standpoint. On the other hand, right, we're seeing salaries increase because more and more people are moving, and it's becoming increasingly obvious to companies who are hiring individuals from outside that they are having to pay those individuals way more than they are paying internal employees who may have been with them for the last 5 or 10 years, and they're having to make some adjustments on the fly, right? We're getting to the point where individual contributors are, looking for money that, in excess of what their manager is earning. So again, you've got internal equity issues that need to be addressed, and largely are being addressed, right? They're not overnight issues. They're big and expensive issues for companies, but again, these are real conversations that are taking place every day. And thankfully, over the last 12 months, we're seeing, gradual improvements in that regard. But by the time, we were getting to sort of the summer of last year, it had also reached a point where, salary expectations were starting to kind of creep up to the point where they were, again, just unsustainable. And people who realize that individuals who are interviewing, who realize that they have a very marketable, very rare skill set, are, almost over leveraging that, to the point where they can convince a company to get them in the door, but they have immediately got a target on there.
You got to justify that ROI pretty quickly.
It's tough. It is, right? And if you've made 2 or 3 moves in 2 or 3 years, which was frowned upon and now not so much, and you've enjoyed the opportunity to, negotiate 20 to 25% or more increases each time you've made that move, right? You are earning very, very good money. And it's one thing to be able to say that you're a very high performer, but if you're surrounded by other high performers that also have, longevity with that company and more experience overall, when it comes time to look across your organization, right, in tougher times, again, you are in danger of sort of shooting yourself in the foot, I think. And so, again, we'd reached a point with companies where they could only do so much to entice these people, they were unwilling to keep paying more and more money, and were starting to get a bit more resentful, about the fact that they were being expected to do that. They were trying to bend over backwards, providing benefits that sort of ticked every single, box that these candidates sort of had in front of them. And again, it just puts them on this sort of pedestal as compared to everyone else in their departments. And I don't think that was a tenable situation long term. So I think we are now at a point where hopefully companies have realized that procurement has a lot of value, that they need to be competitive, and they have a better understanding of what competitive means within procurement, but are, probably operating within some slightly tighter budgetary constraints than they were. And I think that's going to rebalance the market. But I think that's going to leave us in a positive place, certainly a far more positive place than we were in 2-3 years ago.
Well, Mark, I think that's probably a good place to wrap up. Time is coming against us, but I've really, really enjoyed and appreciate the conversation. It actually sounds like on the ground a lot more promising, than what you may hear or perceive from some of those headlines that we talked about earlier, and some fears of the market. And that, yes, if your organization is one that is being targeted, that there are other, not just pockets, but kind of wide open spaces of strength and growth in the procurement market. So really appreciate you taking some time with us, sharing some of what you're seeing with the art of procurement community. And always I ask the one last question, which is, if folks are interested in reaching out to you, speaking with you directly, what's the best place for them to contact you?
The best place is probably LinkedIn. I'm very active on that platform. I contribute often, and if you want to message me, I'll get back to you right away. I'm happy to answer questions sort of formally or informally. If there are hiring managers that really don't know where to turn to find talented people, we can talk to those folks. If there are individuals in the market, whether at the entry level, middle manager level or executive level, who want to understand what a job search strategy looks like beyond just applying to a few jobs here and there and trying to sort of rekindle some old network connections, again, have a chat. I'm happy to provide people with a little bit more of a roadmap of where they might expect to find some of these interesting opportunities, particularly those opportunities that aren't getting the attention of 50, 100, 150 other applicants. And those opportunities do exist. Again, there's a strategy that is involved. It's a little bit more work than it was a year ago, but again, undoubtedly those opportunities exist. And the same goes for people that aren't actively looking but may think they might open themselves up to doing so within the next 6 to 12 months, because this isn't an overnight process, right? Keeping your network fresh, keeping yourself open to opportunities, it's an ongoing effort. I've always encouraged people to put some time and effort toward that on a weekly and a monthly basis. And if ever people have questions about that sort of stuff, they should let me know.
Perfect. And as as I mentioned right at the top of the show, as a practitioner who worked closely with Mark, I would highly recommend anybody who's on the fence to definitely reach out. What I'll do, Mark, is I'll put, as we always do, a link to your LinkedIn profile in our show notes for today's episode, and all the show notes for all of our different podcasts are all at artofprocurement.com/podcast. That's artofprocurement.com/podcast, and you'll find, if you don't find Mark directly on LinkedIn, which should be fairly easy to do, the link will be there in the show notes. So, Mark, one last time, just thank you so much for joining me today. If this episode struck a chord with you, please do send it to somebody. We grow here at Art of Procurement through word of mouth, and that would be really appreciated. You can also support us by giving us a thumbs up, a star rating, or a review wherever you listen to your podcasts. Since 2015, we've built the world's largest free resource for procurement professionals looking to elevate their impact. Our resources span podcasts like this, videos, blog posts, papers, and events. To join us on the inside and to ensure you never miss an episode, a webinar, event, or a post, please do subscribe to our weekly newsletter, This Week in Procurement. You can do that at artofprocurement.com/subscribe. That's artofprocurement.com/subscribe. Thank you for joining us today, and I look forward to seeing you again soon.